Bias and discrimination have been an issue from the beginning for the Tulalip tribes. One Tulalip tribal member has seen and heard this firsthand from a very early age. Growing up Tulalip and being the first in her family to graduate from college to her career as a professor and scientist at the University of Michigan, Stephanie Fryberg has made it her mission to work on race, bias, and discrimination for the Native American culture. Hibulb Conversations had a chance to sit down with Stephanie and hear her story. Hi, I'm Mytyl Hernandez and welcome to Hibulb Conversations. With us today is Stephanie Fryberg. Thank you for being here, Stephanie.
Thank you for having me.
You have accomplished so much in your career and have a lot going on, but let's start at the beginning. What was your childhood like in Tulalip?
Small questions.
Yes.
I mean, I grew up at Hermosa Beach, and I always thought the best part of growing up out in Tulalip was that I had cousins and not friends. And my fondest memories are actually summers at Hermosa, because our parents would go off to work and all the cousins and my siblings, we would go down to the beach and spend all day just hanging out at the beach. And then in the evening, aunts, uncles, grandparents would come down and we'd pull out crab traps and have crab. And so, I mean, I think Tulalip was a tough place in the 70s. I think there was a lot of change happening for us. And there are things about that that really influenced me growing up. I mean, I lived next door to Clem and Dolly, and I got to see the change that my uncle has on this community. And, really such a powerful leader, but yet a gentle, not always so outspoken person. I mean, he was very humble and he did the work and really made a big impact. And I think for me, understanding how that relates to things like self-determination, and which also happens in the 70s, and what it means for us to get to have control of our community. And so I really can remember powerfully, like, both sort of the hardships. It seemed like we were always overcoming hardships out here, lots of trauma, but at the same time we had family and we had things that made us, I mean, our community had no money. I mean, and there's some ways in which that was better. I mean, and I don't mean to, I know people will hear that and think, how can you say that? Right. Like, money is nice. But money comes with a price. And back then there really was a sense if somebody needed something, everybody chipped in. I loved that. I mean, we were a much smaller community. You really knew everybody. So those are the things, like, I loved growing up out here. I loved participating in sports out here. I loved, Johnny Moses did a dance group when I was little, and I loved that. And we would travel and dance and share stories about our people. But yeah, it was a real, like, I think I am who I am because of the way that I got to grow up living next door to my grandparents. I mean, I actually had a bed at my grandparents' house. Right. Like, I had a room there and a room at my mom's house, and I just kind of freely went back and forth. I was very close to my grandparents, and they just had a tremendous impact in my life.
Will you tell us who your grandparents and who your parents are? So
my grandparents are Rose and Shorty Fryberg, and my mom is, Bert and Cookie Robinson. So my mom is Cookie Fryberg Robinson. And
your mom and your grandma were big impacts on your life, big influences.
Huge. I mean, really, really all of them were. I mean, I feel really grateful that I had stable adults in my life who were really about relationship and connecting and caring and getting kids to school and making sure that we got a good education. My grandmother was in the boarding school, and there was a lot of stories she told that were not so great.
Right.
But at the same time, the one thing she was grateful for, and the one thing she really worked to pass on, was a love of reading. And so all of us read. And we didn't have money, but I had books.
Right.
And that was a really powerful thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think about what an advantage it was. A lot of our homes, kids out here didn't have books.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a stack of books in my closet and loved to just hang out and read.
And what schools did you attend?
So I went to Tulalip Elementary,
Okay.
and then through the Marysville School District. So back then it was
from
Marysville Middle School, Marysville Junior High School, and then Marysville Pilchuck High School. Yeah, there weren't any of these other options.
No, for me either.
Yeah.
What was high school like for you?
I mean, I think high school was also a bit of a mixed bag. You know, I think one, it's not a time I would really choose to go back and be part of. Like, it's kind of a funny adolescent time, but also it was a time that had a lot of conflict for me. I saw a lot of the kids that I had grown up with out here really get pushed out of school, and, you know, really saw that it led to not so great outcomes. And it was heartbreaking to me, and trying to understand why it was like that, and you know, why my peers were choosing to leave. And you know, now I understand that it wasn't a choice. You know, there are many ways in which children of color are pushed out, and I certainly had enough experiences, despite being an A student, to understand why, you know, students felt like they didn't belong there.
Yep. After high school, what were your goals?
Well, high school, I mean, honestly, like, I didn't actually know about college, so it was a real interesting, like, I was a straight A student, and I went abroad my junior year, but I went to Denmark.
Wow.
I know. I think of Glenn Gobin calling it Sweden, and using his little Swedish accent, and how, you know, how much teasing I got about it, but I just loved that little accent. But you know, I got to be a senior in high school, and I really didn't have plans.
Okay.
And so, you know, what happens is that I have a conversation with a friend's dad, and, you know, who really tells me, like, he asked me, "Where are you going to college next year?" And it's like October, and I just kind of looked at him, and I was like,
haven't thought about it.
Yeah, and he was like, no, you have to go to college. Like, and so, you know, I basically went to one college fair. My dad said that he, people he worked with, the really smart people, went to Whitman College.
Okay.
So I applied to Whitman College, and I got in with honors at entrance. Yes, shocking, right? And I actually eventually leave Whitman, and again, it's like, in large part due to inequality. It's me getting to that point in my life where I'm starting to understand why my peers dropped out, and I'm starting to understand why our people deal with poverty and inequality, and actually it's throwing me. I mean, I'm feeling bad about being away. I'm struggling with a sense of almost guilt, like survivor guilt.
It's hard for an Indian to be away from their reservation.
It is, yes. And so I end up leaving for a semester, but end up then staying. So I went to just another college, like on the East Coast, and Kenyon. You know, when I applied, I wasn't planning to go for a long time. I just felt like I needed to get away and think.
Yeah.
But they gave me a full ride, and so I ended up getting involved in research, and it was a game changer for me. I started to examine the questions that I wanted to understand.
Yeah. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. We're here with Stephanie Fryberg. So you started out at Whitman in Walla Walla, and then it took you to Kenyon in Ohio. And where did your education take you next?
So then it took me to Stanford University. So I applied to the PhD program there, and I ended up getting a PhD in social and cultural psychology.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then after that, you became a teacher, a professor?
Yep. So I did a 2-year position as an assistant dean at Stanford.
Okay.
But it wasn't, that's kind of a long story. I'm not sure how relevant it is, but it was very helpful to me to learn about how universities worked. And sort of the politics. But yeah, I went to the University of Arizona, and then after I got tenure, I came up here on sabbatical and then got hired by the University of Washington and stayed. And then recently got wooed away by the University of Michigan. You know, Michigan is a very historic university, in particular around psychology. Black psychology started at Michigan. And my hope was that I could build on that and create indigenous psychology in much the same way, where it's this focus on empirical research, really bringing a focus to issues of inequality and how race and discrimination and settler colonialism drive these forces, and really examine how we can undo them.
And did this start the work with RISE?
Well, yes. So RISE is up and coming. So we recently, my team, we applied for a $5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation, and we were one of 10 teams that received one of these grants. And we had proposed starting the RISE Center, and RISE stands for Research for Indigenous Social Action and Equity. RISE is really about both doing research, building a pipeline of researchers, but also putting research to work. So much of like academics, we do science, we do research, we publish it in a journal, and then we rely on other people to translate that work so that it gets used in communities. But there are so few Native people with PhDs that really, if we want our work to be out there, we also have to translate it. Right. And one of the things that I have done over the last 5-6 years is I've been working with some not-for-profit Native philanthropies, and we've had a coalition that's really been working to give voice to Native experience. So I've been working with Crystal Echohawk at Illuma Native, Judith LeBlanc at Native Organizers Alliance, and Nikki Petrie at the Center for Native American Youth. And we have done a number of projects together, really with the idea of how do we change the representations of Native people in society, and how do we allow Native people to both own what the stories are that are out there, like to be our stories rather than some romanticized representation created by Hollywood, created by someone else, but really to take Native voice and amplify it. And so we have been working with film directors in Hollywood. We've been working with different companies, Nike, FedEx, really with the idea of working together with a huge group of Native stakeholders to really both collect data, because we need, Native people need to tell us, right? It's not anyone's job to decide what that representation should be, but also to really get that voice out there and to amplify those voices. And so we have done things collectively that have never been done. And so RISE is the academic center for it. And our long-term goal is really to build these up and really make RISE a space where Indigenous young people who are interested in issues of inequality, discrimination, bias, and how they can help change their community can come and learn from the people affiliated with RISE and come back and do it for their community.
Some of this education research and some programs you've been instituting, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there are a number of them. So on the education side, we had done some early work to look at what needed to change in learning environments to enhance motivation and performance for Native students. And of course, my early work was all centered here at Tulalip, always wanting to give back. But after a while, we really realized that what's good for Native students is actually good for all students. Right. And so we've been working on a curriculum to help teachers rethink how they create identity-safe classrooms. And by identity safe classrooms, they're classrooms where all students feel like they belong and can be successful. And so we've been working at various levels of education with students, with teachers, with building leaders, to really look at both the psychological impact, the impact on performance, and then how do we help translate this so that it can be used at other schools really across the country. And so our long-term goal, we've had a number of wonderful foundations who have funded the work, and so we're hoping to finish the curriculum and actually give it away for free.
Wow.
So we really want schools to be able to access the information, and to, you know, a lot of small school districts don't have funding for professional development, and so this is a way that we can work to put it out there and give it away and really put research to work, because it's all empirically driven. We know that it works, and what's great is it's a model built off Native kids' experiences.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And so, yeah, so it's so exciting.
It is so exciting.
Yeah, yeah. And then the other major line of research we have looks at bias against Native people, and really that cuts across a variety of projects. So everything from looking at, like, my early work looked at the impact of Native mascots on Native children. We've all the way to what is the role of attitudes when we think about mascots, to now studies looking at the role of invisibility in psychological well-being for Indigenous people. Studies with 15,000 Native people in it. I mean, never been done before. We have studies looking at why there's apathy in this country towards murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And so we've built a model to understand what's driving the apathy, and then we do studies to see, like, what do you say to change non-Native people's understanding so that we can alleviate that apathy and really work towards making change. So we have a whole host of issues that we work on, and some are, like, I think of them as fun because, well, I mean, I'm just gonna own it. Like, I'm the scientist, I get to be the nerd, and I love it, I love data. But, like, even little projects like Rick Santorum's comments about America being a blank slate when the settlers got here, and really overlooking and overshadowing the impact of Native people's experiences here in the country. So we've developed some experiments to really look at both what impact those words have for non-Natives and for Native people, but again, like, what does it mean to shift that thinking?
Right. This is fascinating work. I cannot wait to hear more. We're going to take a short break, and when we get back, we'll talk about Native mascots. Welcome back to Hibulb Conversations. We're here with Stephanie Fryberg. Thank you again for being here with us. We talked earlier about your work with Native mascots. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so early on, when I first started as a researcher, one of my first projects actually looked at how public representations, like mascots, influence Native children. And I was really, like, starting out, I was not interested in the mascot issue. The reason there was a condition in our experiment that had a mascot is because back then, to determine what conditions, like what types of public representations we were going to expose Native kids to, and then look at what the effects were, we did a content analysis. And back then, the Cleveland baseball team and the Atlanta Braves baseball team were both in the World Series. And so they came up most in our media analysis. It morphs into Mascot Research after this. So what we did in the first study is we traveled to some communities in Arizona, and students were randomly assigned to one condition. So what that means is that everybody's going to do the same thing, but some people are going to see a representation before doing the survey. And so we expose these Native high school students to either the Cleveland mascot, which was Chief Wahoo, it has since been retired, to in a different condition, they saw Pocahontas, because that was another, so it was it was an image around Disney's Pocahontas. And then in a third condition, they saw a set of negative stereotypes about Native people. High dropout rates, depression, suicide, right? So you would expect this to have negative effects. And then there's a control condition where you're not exposed to anything. And so we're using this group to measure across. So this would be what your expected sort of average, for example, self-esteem. And then you would look at how these different images affect these children's sense of self-esteem. And so what we found in the first study we did is that the Chief Wahoo and Pocahontas lowered self-esteem more than the negative stereotypes. Oh. And the negative stereotypes were significantly lower than the control condition. And so in essence, like the control condition was when we do another study with whites, and when you look at the control condition, self-esteem is the same for natives and whites, which is not generally the case. Generally, they find that most groups of color have lower self-esteem. But when you take away the stereotypes, you take away the public representations, we actually see the same, 3.7 is the mean in both studies. But the difference is that for natives, these representations have an impact. But I was particularly struck by the effect of Disney's Pocahontas and the Chief Wahoo on Native teens, right? And so we followed it up and we conducted a second study where we did the exact same setup, right? And so kids are seeing one of these images or a control. But then instead of asking about self-esteem, we actually ask them about their feelings about their community. And so what we want to know is, we know it's impacting like me at the individual level, but is it also impacting my view of my community? And in this case, what we're looking at is the perception that my community can improve itself, that we have the resources, the ability to make our future better. And so you can also call it community worth, okay? And so it turns out that we find the same effect, where all of these public representations, right, none of which are created by natives, have this impact on Native youth. And so relative to this control condition, but in this case, there's no difference between the negative stereotypes and the Disney's Pocahontas and the Chief Wahoo. Cleveland's. Sorry, it's such a weird mascot. And it was a really, I don't know if you remember it, but it's a really, it was an ugly characterization.
Red face.
Yeah, and so, you know, at that point, like I started showing the research at some talks around the department, and people were really fascinated by it. And so I was really interested, like for me, like theoretically, what I wanted to know is, how do we come to understand who we are and what we will become, and what impact does the outside world have on that, right? So especially because Native people are largely invisible in mainstream society, and the types of representations are really narrow and limiting. And so, you know, the battle over, even among Native people, about whether we should be mascots, I mean, a lot of that is driven by invisibility. Like, we do follow-up work. We know that it's that people who feel like they'd rather be a mascot would rather be a mascot than be invisible. And the problem with that is, it's just poor choices, right? But, you know, we go on, I mean, we followed up, we do another study at a four-year Native university. And in that study, we actually used their Native mascot. And then some of the criticisms we had heard about the Cleveland mascot is that maybe it was the unattractiveness of this particular mascot and the characterization of this mascot, like maybe more honorable mascots wouldn't have the same effect. And so then we brought in an image from, I don't know if you remember, but Chief Alinawek from the University of Illinois, which was always a white male dressed in full Native regalia. And then we brought in the university's mascot, which also I think would be thought of as a more honorable representation. And what we looked at were the effect of these mascots on achievement related goals. And so it turns out that all of the mascots had the same negative effect on achievement related goals, such that when exposed to any of these mascots, it lowered Native college students' future goals. And I think in large part, like, I can go all the way back to different experiences as a kid.
Right. Well,
high school. Well, even like I was a swimmer in high school, and I remember I traveled to this international swim meet, and the judges, the stroke and turn judges, were talking. I could see them, and I was getting out of warm up, and they walked over and said, "We heard that you're Native." And I said, "Yes." And they said, "How did you learn to swim?"
Oh.
And so the underlying assumption was that we couldn't have a pool.
Oh.
Right? Like, we're so primitive. Like, and so they went on to say, like, "We were watching you. You can do flip turns. Like, how did you learn to do that?" And so the first fascinating thing is the idea that they don't think I belong there, right? Like, that it's such an abnormality to be Native and a swimmer. But at that point, like, I was young, and so I wouldn't say that I responded in the best way, because I made up a story where I told them that I learned to swim in the bay, and that I learned to do flip turns by pushing logs out into the bay, and then I would practice flipping off these logs. And these judges ate it up. They were like, "Really? That's so fascinating." I mean, they just were so blown away by it. And unfortunately, my coach heard this story and made me actually go back and tell them the truth, because she was like, "You can't be advancing these stereotypes."
Oh, good for her.
Yeah, good for her. A good lesson for me. I was like 16. But I mean, also in high school, I had a teacher who was my chemistry teacher, who basically came up to me senior year and said, "I want to nominate you for an award. I need to know your grade point average." And so when I told him my grade point average, he basically accused me of lying to him because, and I quote, "We don't have Native students that do that well." And so, you know, it just had really struck me that there are so many ways in which we are constantly influenced by other people's views. And so in the mascot data, we've looked at like ethnic identity, we've looked at identity centrality, like how important being Native is to you. And it's actually the case, like when you look at who endorses Native mascots, it's Native people who don't have a strong sense of like, so they might be highly identified with being Native, but being Native doesn't affect their sense of well-being. So it's not connected to them in that deep, you know, psychologically integrative way. And so similarly, like, you could really see through all these experiences the way that I was constantly having to navigate other people's views.
Right, based on what they
on their and really all of these stereotypes were Hollywood. I mean, at that point, we didn't have any, I mean, this is pre-Smoke Signals, which is the first one that actually depicts us as contemporary people, right? And so, you know, most of what you contend with when you go out there are these really strong stereotypes. And I was really fascinated both from a stereotyping and prejudice perspective, but also from how do our children go out there and decide what to become or figure it out when this is how you're represented.
Thank you so much for your time today. It has been an absolute pleasure sitting here talking with you and hearing the impact you're having on a national level for Native Americans, and I just appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Hibulb Conversations. Thanks for joining us.